Hi everyone. My name is Daniel Kennedy, and I am now I can say that I am a doctor in anthropology. I got my degree, although technically June 13th is the conferral, and so I'll be returning to medical school for my, I believe, eighth year. Um, and yeah, I'll be presenting just kind of a small sliver of my dissertation work um, in a talk entitled No Place Like Home, Relationality, Resistance, and Meaningful Life on the Kansas River. The three of us walked towards the picnic table under the gazebo in Boswell Square Park in Topeka's College Hill neighborhood where my dad grew up, next to the decorative brick wall commemorating the park's establishment in 1922. I used to come with friends here on hot summer days like this one to pass the time, and a wave of nostalgia crests as we sit at the same table my friends and I used as teenagers to get reprieve from the sun. The bricks in the wall nearby commemorate Topekans' contributions to the community. One of them is Lawrence Kennedy, my grandfather who raised his family in a house around the corner. I attended the small ceremony when his brick was added in recognition of his work at the Menninger Foundation, once the largest training center for psychiatrists in the entire US, where he poured himself into establishing halfway houses, temporary quote unquote rehabilitative homes for those believed incapable of making one. I brought Katie and Kevin here to interview together at their request to get away from the hustle and bustle of the Southside Kansas River community where they lived. And I take a moment to appreciate my memories of this place in preparation for our conversation. Under the gazebo, Katie tells me about her life and how she became homeless. She remembers the day she, quote, fell off the wagon, a series of cascading events that would lead her to homelessness about 5 years ago. She was a nursing care worker at an assisted living facility for adults with cognitive disabilities in rural Kansas for many years. She inevitably grew close to many of the residents. The work was difficult and the worker turnover was very high. So she started using stimulants to make it through consecutive shifts, as they were seemingly always short-staffed. One resident she had known for years became terminally ill just as several workers unexpectedly quit on the same day, leading Katie to work 4 days in a row to be with him in his final moments. Ever since that day, I gave up on everything, she says, fighting back tears, remembering her friend's death and her dedication to making sure he did not die alone. After his death, she found escape in drugs, mainly meth, which she continues to use between bouts of attempt sobriety. Unable to return to the facility where she quit her job, depleted her small savings, and was eventually evicted in the dead of winter with over a foot of snow on the ground. Like many other similarly displaced folks, she made her way to Tent City, Kansas in 2019 out of necessity. Tent City was a growing agglomeration of more than 70 permanently unsheltered and unhoused people in their homes in the wooded area sandwiched between crisscrossing train tracks and depots in the shadow of one of North Dakota's several enormous grain elevators pictured here. In 2018, Tent City was growing steadily as more people were permanently displaced from their previous homes and moved into the area. They found it safer to live alongside one another than in the sparse and scattered encampments that previously characterized unsheltered homelessness in Topeka. It was conveniently located next to the main buildings and operations of one of Topeka's largest social service agencies and its sole homeless shelter operator. Its sudden growth initially led to the installation of temporary bathroom facilities and a state response to other identified necessities for the growing community. Its residents even went as far as electing a mayor and a city liaison to organize these efforts. Katie found relative safety living alongside others outside and received a starter tent. Her neighbors proved instrumental to her survival that first winter, teaching her to make makeshift stoves and heat sources, and she made it through without permanent damage to her extremities from frostbite, something that's commonly seen for the folks living on the Kansas River. Quote, I was so cold, I survived, and I was happy that I survived. But man, my toes were hurting, she reminisces, with a rightful sense of accomplishment before continuing her recollection of Tent City. God didn't have a home. He made his home where he laid his head. That's your home. It's everywhere. It's not just a house, you know. That's what Tent City was. It was our home. And just because of our tents and tarps or whatever, it was still our home. Unfortunately, Tent City's persistence and visibility drew the ire of resentful housed residents and eventually pushed the state to reverse course. It was forcibly cleared by the Topeka Police and Sanitation Departments in April 2020 in one of Topeka's first well-publicized large-scale sweeps, a term describing state-run violent clearances and redisplacements of unhoused people that regularly take place nationwide. Over the next several years, I would learn more about the residents, histories, and demise of Tent City, Kansas, and would learn how unhoused Topekans built new senses of belonging, home, and meaningful life after picking up the pieces while facing increasingly regular sweeps and land use restrictions. In this talk, I will work to present a snapshot of what the communities on the Kansas River were like between January 2023 and August 2024, before most people were redisplaced as part of the broad implementation of a draconian anti-camping ordinance. I'll start with some background information about Topeka and why I chose to work there before turning to the communities I learned from during my fieldwork period from October 2022 to August 2024. I present an understanding of relational home that was shared by most of the almost 30 Kansas River residents I interviewed for this project by showing some interspersed quotes alongside images. Then I'll turn towards how most of these communities were systematically dismantled by the state through a process of criminalization and what DeGenova and Roy call the legal production of illegality. I conclude with thoughts on how the relational homes and meaningful lives constructed by unhoused people living on the Kansas River might be read as resistance to mass dispossession, dehumanization, and criminalization of poor people under contemporary neoliberal racial capitalism, standing in contrast to depictions of unhoused life as perpetual suffering. I ask you all to consider how we might collectively go about learning from and supporting self-determined dwelling in the world, and how this might hold liberatory potential for us all in the era of mass housing and incarceration. Although personal entanglements to the city of Topeka were the impetus for choosing the locale for this project, there's also additional demographic, political, and historical reasons why this site is ethnographically productive for work on homelessness criminalization and historical entanglements with deinstitutionalization. First off, Topeka is a smaller American city of about 125,000 people, with about 175,000 people living in the county, in Shawnee County, where it's located. But despite being a smaller population than Kansas City suburbs about an hour to its north and by driving, and Wichita to its south, it holds political importance as the state capital of Kansas. It also was once home, as I mentioned before, to the Menninger Foundation, the largest training center for psychiatrists in the country, who once counted famed anthropologist Margaret Mead on its board of directors. It's also one of the more racially and ethnically diverse cities in Kansas, according to US Census data. These non-white communities in Topeka were reflected in the people I met through this work. The city's historically had a longstanding Black community that experienced decades of redlining and segregation, but resisted through robust participation in the civil rights movement, culminating in the 1954 US Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, which outlawed racial segregation in US public schools. Along with its proximity to several large tribal nations in neighboring Oklahoma, it's just 30 miles south of a Potawatomi Nation reservation and 50 miles south of the Kickapoo Nation reservation. Although Topeka has historically had a sizable Mexican-American community, its Latinx community has grown significantly with new arrivals from Central America, attracted by industrial employment and agricultural processing and related industries. These histories shape the demographics of my interlocutors, and I include them here to really try to dispel perceptions of Middle America as being racially homogenous. And these are images of the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site. Additionally, Midwestern communities like Topeka in the United States are critically understudied, often seen as insignificant backward flyover communities, unworthy of scholarly attention. It is precisely for this reason that critical Midwestern theorists have called for renewed ethnographic attention to this geographic region, to not only address the erasure of significant non-white communities, but also to critique the unquestioned cultural meaning it holds as the site of American ordinariness and contemporary American white supremacy, illustrated in the discourse of the forgotten white MAGA community. Further, critical ethnographic work that adds nuance to regional understandings in arbitrary red-blue state borders is important for better understanding flows of capital and carceral technologies between center and periphery. Considering, for example, that progressive California has been essentially the pioneer in mass incarceration and anti-homeless policy, and the brutal practices employed in sweeps that are now commonplace nationwide. I began fieldwork for No Place Like Home in October 2022 with the intent of studying a network of transitional living facilities like the one I worked at between 2015 and 2017, pictured here, only to learn that they had all been shuttered in 2018 due to a decade of state austerity and Medicaid privatization. I learned that in its wake and in the aftermath of the mass unhousing spurred by the COVID-19 pandemic and housing consolidation, there was significant public anxiety in Topeka over conspicuous permanent encampments in the city, even through sub-zero temperatures in the wintertime. A phenomenon that most Topekans like me can't recall ever occurring in recent memory. Official point-in-time homeless counts required by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the U.S. Housing Department of Housing and Urban Development, demonstrate steadily increasing numbers of unsheltered, unhoused people in Topeka since at least 2016, represented by this table and graph. These counts are typically held on a single day in mid to late January and are limited in their quote-unquote objective usefulness because of their limited scope and reliance on volunteer labor. To include the data here, though, to quantitatively supplement pervasive sentiments in my own anecdotal experience, that unsheltered homelessness was increasing substantially in Topeka since at least 2017, when I left to move to Los Angeles. The official state-sanctioned numbers of homeless people show steady increases in the total number of homeless people in Topeka, which coincide with an increase in the number of unsheltered people living outside. What's most striking and has caused the most alarm among social service workers is the percentage of counted homeless folks living as unsheltered, around 40% beginning in 2022 onwards. Most, if not all, people who were involved with running the counts recognized that these were significant undercounts. The reason for these are measured in anecdotal increases are multifactorial, as I observed through my fieldwork and learned from the folks that I met. While unsheltered homelessness in Topeka was growing pre-pandemic, due to the state's austerity crises, the COVID-19 pandemic sharply increased the number of chronically homeless, visibly unsheltered people, many of whom moved to Tent City. The virus's disabling effect directly contributed to many people's unhousing. In addition to worsening precarity, people lost their jobs to the pandemic-induced crisis. Pam, for instance, was forced from her home after spending 2 months at the local hospital with a severe COVID-19 infection. She was evicted during her hospitalization for non-payment of rent and lost her job at a local automotive parts factory, forcing her to live in her car for a year and a half. She was finally able to find a new apartment only after paying off a few utilities debts and accompanying rate payments, but remains saddled with insurmountable medical debt she will likely never pay off. Other people I met shared similar stories, with employment disruptions leading to de facto eviction after sustained bouts of severe illness, all despite a pandemic-related eviction moratorium in Kansas that was weakly enforced to many tenants' detriment. Other housing and development plans have pushed rents steadily higher in Topeka, contributing to increased unhousing, which have driven the steady increase of sweeps. As a social service worker myself in 2015, for example, many of the folks on my client list that I was assigned to visit paid about $150 per month for a small one-bedroom apartment, and were able to afford this using their meager monthly disability checks, which typically amounted to about $750 per month. During fieldwork, however, I would meet several people looking for housing who were struggling to find anything under $600. And the cheapest options were abhorrently substandard, or what one interview called, quote, just a room with a light bulb, unquote. The rise in rents mirrors processes taking place throughout the US, where housing consolidation under private equity and billionaire oligarchs has led to rental unit oligopolies that are conspicuously felt in smaller cities like Topeka. Consider, for example, that in 2015 alone, Oklahoma-based billionaire investor Lou McGinnis acquired 20% of all rental units in the entire city of Topeka, a percentage that has steadily increased in Topeka and other Kansas communities in ensuing years. That's depicted in these images where, because Lou McGinnis stopped paying for sanitation services in most of his buildings after a dispute with the city, trash began to pile up. And it was so noticeable that it was felt, in greater than a fifth of all rental units in the entire city. In Wichita, Kansas, which is Kansas's biggest city of about 500,000 residents, Lou McGinnis's holdings alone account for about a quarter of all evictions in that city, demonstrating that housing consolidation has reached a point where mass and housing can be attributed to single individual landlords. Instead of trying to address the housing crisis, however, the state has prioritized redevelopment plans in the hopes of stemming a declining local population and to attract desired younger salaried professionals. In the early 2010s, the city of Topeka invested significant public resources into refurbishing old buildings in downtown Topeka for private development, pricier rental units, and similarly established the North Topeka Arts and Entertainment District just a couple blocks away from the site of Tent City. The pandemic led to additional public incentives to attract remote tech workers through its Choose Topeka program, which offers relocating workers an unconditional stipend of $15,000 in their first year, along with property tax exemptions for 5 years. At the end of my fieldwork period in October 2024, the city announced the Topeka Riverfront Vision Plan, yet another development scheme that would add pedestrian walkways, storefronts, and residential lots for property developers along the Kansas River, where the majority of unhoused people once lived when I first started fieldwork in October 2022. These announcements coincided with very public debates about, quote, what to do about the homeless, unquote, amid an unending stream of austerity for sustainable housing programs for poor, working class, elderly, or disabled people. This laid bare the enormous contradictions of contemporary housing and economic policy. Faced with intense sweeps, these contradictions were not lost on the former residents of Tent City, who held their own ideas of what to do about themselves that have been largely ignored. What is happening in Topeka parallels similar patterns throughout the US. Some quickly point to the deinstitutionalization movement and failures of American community mental health care as key drivers of contemporary unsheltered homelessness. While perhaps partially true, critical readings of the deinstitutionalization mythos point out that this line of nostalgic thinking centers the old state asylum that systematically erased and warehoused thousands of people labeled as social deviants, and obscures other important political economic processes that have sharply increased economic and social inequality and decayed already dysfunctional social safety nets since the 1980s. The well-documented neoliberalization of the American welfare state, beginning under the Reagan administration, gutted what little public housing policy for poor people that once existed that was secured through local and national civil rights struggles of prior decades. Similarly, the so-called war on poverty of the 60s and 70s has now turned into a war on the poor that continues today. Decades of poverty stigmatization, largely through racialized tactics and discourse, and punitive measures against poor people have led to renewed criminalization of extreme poverty and homelessness in the United States. Anti-vagrancy laws, which historically were used to criminalize homelessness as well as political dissidents or other people seen as undesirable, were largely invalidated in the United States through court rulings in the 1940s through the 1970s, alongside, of course, popular movements. These rulings have seen a resurgence in the past decade, taking the form of anti-camping ordinances, public nuisance laws, and sanitation codes, which fundamentally are intended to govern the use of public space and who can occupy it through what DeGenova and Roy call the legal production of illegality. Despite these structural forces, the current and former residents I met demonstrate the possibility of meaningful life amid constant struggle against organized abandonment. Descriptions of Tent City and of life on the river as home is illustrative of the many ways homeless Topekans necessarily craft new senses of home to assert belonging in the world that challenges our normative understandings of what home is and stakes a claim for occupying and using public land when people are made to be unhoused. In Katie's description of Tent City, for instance, she challenges the idea of a home synonymous with materiality, quote, not just a house, unquote, and suggests that home to her is spatially boundless. It's everywhere, made wherever one dwells, quote, where he laid his head, unquote. I saw this as a way of making sense of her experience, characterized by the constant struggle over a place to safely dwell and for the materials necessary to sustain life, while simultaneously rejecting the conditions attached to quote unquote permanent housing programs like sobriety, poverty wage employment, and substandard rental units, as is often the case for homeless people in Topeka and elsewhere, if they even exist at all. For the purposes of the talk, I want to highlight two communities and show some pictures and videos of what life was like, with some quotes interspersed to really illustrate the relational home that I encountered when I was conducting my fieldwork. So the majority of folks, when I first arrived in Topeka, lived along the banks of the Kansas River in front of these woods, actually, in these kind of wooded areas that you see here. And it was split primarily into two different communities. One that I will refer to as the North Side, which is the one that kind of is depicted here, and that at this point in time no longer exists. And the other one is called the South Side. And I'll show some maps here that illustrate where they are located geographically in the city. So the North Side was located right here between two major bridges. And this was the one that was really close to the site of Tent City. You can see here in the image this grain elevator right behind this grain elevator, and underneath the bridge is where Tent City used to be. And in the aftermath of Tent City's sweep, people scattered along the river and in other kind of encampments throughout North Topeka that were referred to as the suburbs until they were cleared in 2023. And the South Side, and then here's a quote from an interlocutor that I refer to as Ryan, who talks about the importance of people in his understanding of home. Now, the North Side and suburbs also notably, in contrast to the South Side, which was a more remote community, the North Side and suburbs primarily were made up of folks who were elderly and disabled so that they could be closer to service agencies and food banks, and closer also to sidewalks and roads so that they could actually use. Many folks use wheelchairs or crutches so that folks could actually use those devices without, getting stuck in the mud, for example, as you see here. And it's also notable that folks were already living in fairly precarious conditions just because they were living along a floodplain. And so when it would rain, folks oftentimes would get flooded out. But at the time, there was no legal mechanism for the state to evict people off of public land in Kansas. And the lands along the banks of the Kansas River is public land. That would change, as I'll explain here in a second. But that was kind of the lay of the land when I first arrived. And so I encountered critical theorization of home, like in Katie's or in Ryan's, in most interviews I conducted with unhoused Topekans, which often stood in stark contrast to the normative home as a material site of accumulation and inherent stability that's pervasive in American cultural references, housing and economic policy, and social service workers' perspectives and interventions with their clients. My homeless interlocutors' perspectives demonstrated the fiercely contested nature of home as a system of meaning from which emerge powerful forms of material, relational, and social organization. I argue that homeless Topekans' homemaking experiences might offer productive critiques and resistance to hegemonic forms of contemporary homeless subjectivity and racial capitalism. Following radical housing theorists, I suggest that relational understandings of home and its dwelling practices represent forms of resistance to habitual hegemonic forms of home under contemporary neoliberal racial capitalism that have contributed to the mass unhousing, dispossession, and criminalization of poor people we see today throughout the US. And thank you for the reminder. And more broadly throughout the world. I think of these critical experiences of relational homemaking as a means through which the other folks I met, as a means through which folks tenaciously assert belonging in the world that centers relationality over materiality, building meaningful life that resists reduction to defective surplus body or criminalized other. Following radical housing theorists, I argue that this produces dwelling practices that resist normative forms of living and dwelling shaped by larger social structures, rented apartment and house dwelling, for example, poverty wage labor, and material accumulation and excess. While folks construct relational homes in response to dispossession, dehumanization, and criminalization, I interpret this as a form of ideological and material resistance for continued personhood in life under contemporary neoliberal racial capitalism in the US, which people often describe as a sense of freedom. This freedom to build meaningful lives through relational home resists the conditions of bare life, organized abandonment, and criminalization reinforced by state action and cultural views of moral failure and inherent criminality imposed on the homeless. Following interpretations of homelessness and other forms of dispossessed life as resistance to what Lencioni calls dwelling as difference, it suggests that continued meaningful life built in spite of these structural forces are ways through which the quote unquote homeless living on the Kansas River challenge their objectification and criminalization to forcibly carve out moments of love, joy, friendship, community, solidarity, and a sense of belonging, or what one resident described as good times. And so this is another quote just from a former Tent City and Northside resident, that home to Julia is not a structure or even a tent. It's who you're with. And that, material structures come and go, but it's the people that you love and the memories that you make with them that remain. And this is a picture of just some of the structures that used to exist on the north side of the Kansas River. People, would establish homes alongside one another and would even keep pets. This was fairly common, but these would eventually be forcibly dismantled. And to be honest, I'm not sure what happened to this resident. A lot of folks kind of scattered, and a number of folks also passed when they were swept. And so I think I'm going to go ahead and show this quick video just to illustrate. So you can kind of make out some of the structures of folks living along the north side of the Kansas River. And you can see this pathway that sort of leads to more agglomerations of structures and people's homes. And so these are a couple of pictures of the south side. The south side was a lot more remote, and I'm going to go ahead and not show where it was on the map just because it still exists. It's technically on private land, which actually makes oddly, which I am happy to talk about more in Q&A, makes it, I guess I won't have time for Q&A, but it makes it a little bit difficult to clear. And this is another quote from Connor, a Southside resident, who explicitly critiques kind of the mode of living, when he has a job or when he had a place, that, all he would do is work all the time when he was housed, and, living on the South Side made a lot more sense because he was able to have a lot more time with the folks that he cared about. And these are two other images of just the ways in which people, kind of ingeniously use the land. Sorry, I'm gonna kind of rush here. And here, yeah, again, this is another quote from a resident, Jayla, illustrating kind of the emphasis on relationality and articulating her view of home. And so the suburbs on North Side ended up being cleared through a series of kind of steps that began in November 2023 with the passage of a draconian anti-camping ordinance in the city of Topeka that was fairly unenforceable until the Supreme Court case ruling Grants Pass versus Johnson in June 2024. And the map that I showed earlier, this red line, this blue line, and this green line show the different phases in which people were swept on the north side of the river. And I know I'm at time, but I'm just going to quickly wrap this up in like 30 seconds. And you can see that people have been pushed about 3 miles, and a number of people, including folks that I know, have died. And I included this quote here also to just illustrate the creeping calls for reinstitutionalization that are happening as kind of this issue gets worse. And I think that is cause for great alarm, and I think should be discussed. And I'm glad that actually this kind of came up even in the previous talk. And so I'll skip this, but in Grants Pass versus Johnson legalized the enforcement of the anti-camping ordinance that led to the complete clearance of the north side of the river. And ultimately, the clearance was really, really violent. And the city just would clear entire patches of trees. As you can see, these patches of trees are kind of mark where people's homes once were. And this quote from Laura kind of illustrates the certainly the relational anxieties and the sadness that these sweeps caused for folks. And I'm not going to show this video, but and yeah, I think I'll go and just skip to this final quote. I think is kind of beautiful, and I'm going to end on this. And it comes from critical housing theorist Michel Ancione, who studies squatters in Europe. But why is it that homeless people in our cities are still framed as the residual force of the lumpen proletariat, bored products of neoliberal entrepreneurialism, or grateful bodies used to celebrate supposedly loving acts of care, instead of being seen in their everyday embodied struggles and occupation of public space as a primary example of resistance against housing precarity? They moved the horizon in asking for infrastructures to sustain collective solidarities, in demanding harm reduction instead of institutionalization, in asserting the right to being vagrant and free, in advocating Black justice method, in makeshift autonomous arrangements and locally based provisioning, and in fostering truly intersectional agendas and dialectical confrontation. And yeah, I'll end with that. And I hope that we really can center the self-determination of people and really learn from the relational homemaking that that folks engage in. Because I think as this issue potentially gets worse, we might find ourselves mass unhoused ourselves. Thank you all.